Please tell us about the main elements and probably latest disinformation campaigns promoted by Moscow and its peculiar features.
Mm-hmm. Well, Moscow is very good at adapting its narratives to the particular national contexts, and I think sometimes that's something that's lacking in the West's counter-propaganda efforts, by which I mean that in Russia they're very good at noticing which narratives resonate just organically, and then using those, tapping into them and exploiting them, either for their own purposes or simply because these are narratives that sow division or in some way harmful or in some way work against those who work against Russia's interests. But there's also then that second level of spreading particular narratives that are quite clearly, quite clearly work in Russia's favour. And if we think about the UK, for example, where Russian propaganda is having a very hard time because British people are incredibly pro-Ukrainian, there you see narratives that are very much focused, for example, on the idea of great Russian culture. So I've been monitoring Russian strategic communications in Britain since before the start of the full-scale invasion and since afterwards, and there's been a really big shift towards a real focus on the idea that Russia has this great culture, and okay, maybe you don't like Putin, but it's just Putin, and the rest of Russia is wonderful. And right now we're seeing a big effort in terms of promoting the notion that Russia would never attack NATO countries. Perhaps we could just abandon Ukraine and then everything will be fine, they'll be satisfied, the crocodile will be satisfied, as Winston Churchill did not say. So there's that context where Russia understands it's working in a very hostile environment in the UK. Of course, in a country like Germany, there's much more for it to exploit, and we've seen that with the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, and then, of course, their position in the polls is somewhat worrying for anybody who is a supporter of Ukraine, and they're able to exploit long-standing fears, long-standing cultural issues, and also I would say cultural misunderstandings or historical misunderstandings in terms of quite how World War II occurred. For example, Russia is very good at playing on German guilt over the crimes of Nazism, but it's managed to almost steal Ukraine's voice from that narrative of the Second World War. There's an increasing but still very small understanding in Germany of what Germany did to Ukraine specifically, and that the Soviet Union was not just Russia. And then if we come to the American case, well, America is very, like all superpowers, very concerned with itself, very inwards looking. To a certain extent that's understandable, and right now Russia is able to really play on some of those isolationist narratives, but I think it's always worth remembering that these narratives generally tend to exist anyway. If we're talking in the broader sort of more global scheme of things, Russia is just very good at tapping into them and exacerbating them.
What, in your opinion, should be the systematic work, and how should it be built to counter such malign activity? Mm-hmm. Maybe which types of actors would be playing the most critical role to this end?
It's a good question, and I hope I don't come across as too hawkish, though perhaps in Kiev one can't be too hawkish. I would say that the best line of defense right now would be attack, in the sense that we can't just respond. Of course, it's important to debunk, to educate, media literacy, critical understanding, critical thinking are very, very important skills, just as a skill set for one's citizens. But Ukraine has an incredible number of people who work on disinformation who work on countering disinformation compared to the number that we have in the so-called West. So I in no way want to suggest we should take resources away from that. But I think there also needs to be more activity on information narratives that target Russia itself. So rather than just protecting ourselves, also working to perhaps give Russia a taste of its own medicine, because it's not enough to just support Ukraine, unfortunately, right now, because of the different political situations. There also needs to be a thought about how to further damage Russia, bluntly. And one of the ways to do that is through the information space and through looking at why certain narratives in Russia have resonance, looking at what what the Kremlin propaganda uses, because the Kremlin propaganda uses it because it works. It doesn't use it because it doesn't work. And so if you can think that narrative works, but that narrative could also be quite helpful to us, then there's a need to exploit that, rather than, unfortunately, at the moment, a lot of Western counter-propaganda is just translating into Russian the sort of arguments you might make to a British person. And
that doesn't work.
Doesn't work for some reason. So I would say a much more culturally attuned approach to propaganda is very much required.
So you think government sector or non-government sector should play a big role to do so?
I think they should both play a role, because of course government has the resources, often it has access to certain technologies or to certain methods perhaps of spreading or making the information feel more organic. But you also need the NGO, you need that flexibility. So I think this is really one of those areas where you need the government for scale, and you need the NGOs or the third sector, or even just experts working on this, to come together for creativity. And there needs to be an almost blank slate approach, I think, towards this more active form of defence in the information space, of just, if you have a good idea, come on, let's hear it and let's see what we can do, because things are bad and it's time to start thinking creatively when things are bad.
Yeah, that's true. Well, you touched upon the United States, Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Many in Ukraine, like average citizens who get the information about the campaign from the news, they hear some statements about potentially settling the war,
Mm-hmm.
and there have been some concerns
Mm-hmm.
about that.
Mm-hmm.
Recently, ex-Prime Minister of Great Britain, Boris Johnson, he penned an op-ed where he suggested that Donald Trump, if he wins the election, might as well switch or do something really unexpected
Mm-hmm.
about his stance to this war and to potential settlement.
Mm-hmm.
What is your opinion
Mm-hmm.
about this candidate at the moment?
So I think you used a very opposite word there of unexpected. Donald Trump is incredibly unpredictable. Actually, I mean, he's a very astute political person. He's very much not an idiot, though he may come across as one sometimes. But he's very politically astute, but he's also very, I think it's fair to say, egotistical. And it's quite easy to understand how these dictators find it very easy to flatter Trump's ego, but it's also very easy to imagine a scenario where he begins to dislike them, where he feels offended by them, etc. So I struggle either way to think concretely this is a complete disaster for Ukraine. I think it's pretty obvious it's not good for Ukraine. His election would not be a good thing for Ukraine, but the idea it would be a complete disaster, that doesn't really match up if we look at the first term, which is, you know, when it was the first time that lethal weapons were sent to Ukraine. Actually, sanctions on Russia hardened during that time. There was a very strong response against Nord Stream. So he can't just overturn American foreign policy in the space of his term. What I worry about more is a combination of factors, which is that America's, I suppose, foreign policy or global strategy has for a long time now been turning more towards the Indo-Pacific. And Europe really needs to grow up, in the sense, not Ukraine, but in the sense of some of the major countries in Europe need to understand that we have this security that we've had since the end of the Cold War, not because it's a God-given right, and not because we all learned how to hold hands and live happily ever after, but because America provides it to us. And right now, because Ukraine fights, essentially, Ukraine and America are currently providing us with that security. And it's really time we paid for it. We started making weapons that could actually be used. And bluntly, as harsh as it sounds, just grew up and became adults about the threat that's facing the European security architecture. Because anybody who thinks this stops with Ukraine is, well, politely a bit silly.
Well, yeah, actually, many European politicians are turning to realize and to officially state that we should not look up to the Americans. We should be and pose as an own force that can stand against Russia, against its potential aggression, and deter it as much as possible. We see this European unity, but some actors, some member states still have an opposing view to that. do you think anyone needs to work precisely, directly, to change public attitudes of voters who elected those leaders who are now voicing such statements in opposition to the majority of European member states? If it needs to be done at all.
I think it does need to be done. I think it needs to be done on a very open and honest level. I think the reason why some of these populist leaders appeal is because there's a general fear. I think everybody senses, across most European countries, that the current situation is not tenable. That there is a lot of risk that the lives to which we've become accustomed, the security, bluntly, to which we've become accustomed, it might not be forever. And so there's a lot of fear going around. And even in a country like the UK, where people are very supportive of Ukraine, people feel like the politicians aren't telling them the whole truth about the gravity of the situation. And then that makes them panic, and they just want the war to stop, and they therefore become more open to people or to populist leaders who say that they have simple answers, we can just make Ukraine negotiate. I mean, how they will make Ukrainians negotiate, and of course who Ukrainians are going to negotiate with, and what exactly Ukrainians are going to negotiate, those details, populists don't give you those details. They just give you nice solutions to very complicated problems. And I think that until less populist, more traditionally democratic leaders sit down and have an honest conversation about what is the essence of this war, and that this is a war, of course, for Ukraine and against Ukraine and over Ukraine, but this war is genuinely an existential threat to the Euro-Atlantic security architecture that I've lived my whole life in, for example. If nobody sits down and explains that, then by the time everybody realizes it, it's going to be too late. Our societies need to prepare us. I mean, can you prepare? You would know better than me as a Ukrainian whether or not it's possible to really, truly prepare for war. But there's certainly certain things that could be done in terms of resilience or even in terms of practical measures. And I just think it's high time that some politicians bluntly had the guts to sit down and talk to their populations openly about what is at risk and why it is very much in our interest to help Ukraine. We're not helping Ukraine just because we're nice and cuddly. We're helping Ukraine because it's directly in our national interests. And again, I don't want to overpraise Britain. I do think that Britain is in a better position than some other countries, but still we are lacking that conversation, because in Britain we need to rearm. We need to rearm, and we need to make the sorts of weapons that will be necessary, not fancy, silly tanks that, have 50 different gadgets but are too noisy to run. And until we sit down and have that conversation, I don't think there's going to be that public or popular appetite for it, because you need to explain why we're going to have to spend so much money on rearmament and why it's needed. And I do think that issue has been lacking. We relied on the Ukrainians to make their case, but it's not just your case. It's a case for our security too, so it's time we made the arguments ourselves.
Well, dwelling on that issue, I'm sure you speak extensively with expert circles all across Europe on your topic and the surrounding ones. Do you feel that pundits and politicians and journalists are feeling this, as we call, fatigue from the Ukraine war? Is there this sense growing in Europe right now? And also, as you mentioned, some voices are already saying out loud that Europe should prepare, like Admiral Bauer, for example. He spoke quite bluntly about the need to prepare for a potential war, for a potential conflict, direct conflict with Russia. So is it helping to maybe tame this fatigue, if there is any?
I don't think it's fatigue, because how can it be fatigue? It's not like we've all been fighting on, the front for 2 years without any rotation. We're not tired. We just lack resilience. It's not fatigue, it's a euphemism. Is there a lack of resilience in the West? Yes, there is, and I think it's linked to some of the questions we just discussed, that people in the public, they just want politicians to sit down and not actually... I think if you speak to people like idiots, they'll be idiots, and if you speak to people like they're intelligent people, then there'll be intelligent people. Speak to the audience you wish you had, right? And if somebody would just sit down and explain calmly and clearly what are the risks, nobody wants to see NATO at war with Russia. Nobody wants that. But there's more than one way to wage a war, and the idea that Russia would stop at Ukraine and it wouldn't then start some sort of hybrid attacks, on Daugavpils, on Narva, it seems highly unlikely to me. I don't see how Putin could stay in power without continuing some war with the West, right? Because it's a special military operation against Ukraine and a war with the West in the framing. So he needs to support that. I don't really see a way out of this for him, for his regime, rather. So that's one point. But the other issue is that, yes, you do have some people, of course, who will come out and say, oh, it's time to end it. But bluntly, they never, ever have an answer to how. How do we actually end it? Okay, it's nice to have dialogue, but this is a particular type of view that one finds especially in the US, especially among a certain group of people who are very focused on nuclear non-proliferation and the threat of escalation. And I don't mean that in a dismissive way. Nobody wants to see nuclear war. Nobody's going to benefit from that. It's, of course, right and proper. But there's so much emphasis on that then the focus goes into, well, Russia is a great power, but we can force Ukraine to negotiate. But they can't. They can't. And I think that there's a broader issue that informs that, which is we have a lot of people who maybe know about Russia, but they know about Russia because they spent time in Moscow with certain people. They didn't live in the real Russia, bluntly. Moscow's not Russia, London's not the UK, etc. And they don't know anything about Ukraine, but unfortunately, they're allowed to write about Ukraine as if they were experts on Ukraine as well. So I think there's quite a lot of different issues that come together, a lack of Ukraine expertise, a particular focus on the risk of nuclear escalation that makes people very, very risk averse for understandable reasons, but that is, I think, quite short-sighted or perhaps sometimes overblown. And then you also have the issue that there's just a general lack of resilience that I think comes from a lack of politicians willing to properly inform their population about what the essence of this war means for them, and that this isn't just a war in a faraway land.
You spoke about forcing Ukraine to negotiate and how it's probably impossible. What do you think are the motives behind this coordinated effort to promote in international media on the part of Russia the idea, the assumption that Russia is allegedly ready for peace talks with Ukraine, given that Russia's actions on the battlefield and against the Ukrainian rear, against the peaceful cities, speak the opposite?
Well, not just the actions, also Putin's own words. I mean, if anybody, it's a shame more of these Russia analysts can't read Russian, because then they might be able to read what he said, and that would make it easier for everybody, because we could all be on the same page. Because he says quite bluntly, he spoke about his conquest, like Zavoyevania the other day. I mean, he's not hiding the imperialist objectives. You can read on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. You can read all of this stuff. So, yeah. So I'm not sure. I mean, essentially that group, this idea, in the New York Times, that it came from, this idea that Putin is sending quiet signals while sending very loud bombs elsewhere. I mean, it comes from a group that have been going out there since March. And they are, again, from that group who see Russia as a great power, who see Crimea as essentially Russian, who believe the Russian narrative that, oh, if you take Crimea, then, then there'll be trouble, then you've crossed a red line. But, I mean, how many red lines of Russia have been crossed already, and really nothing has happened? There's some very funny memes on Russian nationalist Telegram about Putin's red lines that are not very favourable to him, despite the fact that these people are incredibly pro-war. So I think that people want to believe that there's a way to negotiate with Putin. People want to believe that he's pragmatic. And I think in some ways this is an ideological issue for the West, our ideological issue, the idea that everybody is essentially rational and that now we're in this post-ideological age and all people really care about is money and there aren't any kind of driving ideas or motives or purposes. And I think that's something that the West gets wrong about Russia, because there is, of course, Putin and the elites care about their resources, etc., etc. But there's also a strange ideology behind this, and also Ukraine's position in relation, the way that Russia has built up its historical narratives, pretty dependent on Ukraine. So I remember Lavrov once said, oh, Ukraine has no history without Russia. But really the Kremlin has no historical narrative without Ukraine, because the whole 1,000 years is because they're putting themselves as the heirs of Kiev and Rus. The idea that Russia is this great cultural messianic power, well, it can't even attract, Russian speakers in Kharkiv to want to join it. So, and the idea it's even a great military expeditionary force, again, it couldn't take Kharkiv. So all of its great powerness, all of its notion of who it is, really crumbles if it can't subjugate Ukraine. And there is this ideational element that the West overlooks, and also with Ukraine, that this is about fighting for something much bigger than just a piece of territory, even much bigger than people. It's about fighting for Ukraine as an idea and Ukraine's right to be free, to be sovereign. Sometimes probably to make the wrong decisions, but they're Ukraine's decisions to make. And I think people have begun to forget about. People like to talk a lot about values, and they use values a lot in their rhetoric. But I think too many of us have forgotten that those values meant something once, and that people died for them. And unfortunately, people are dying for them again.
The war we see that is grinding, and this 24 is going to be the year of defense for Ukraine. And given the potential lack of good news about more liberated settlements across Ukraine coming from our armed forces, given the continuous strikes on Ukrainian cities and villages, what do you think will be the triggers that Russia will use in propaganda tailored for Ukrainian audiences to break this unity that the people of Ukraine have in order to repel this aggression?
Yes, I think it's going to be a very difficult year for Ukraine in terms of Russian propaganda efforts. There's of course going to be a lot of focus on supposed splits between the political side and the military side, going to be a lot of focus on fears around the way that mobilization is conducted in some areas, and there's going to be a lot of disinformation, or perhaps sometimes just exaggeration of things that did happen, but you're just making them appear much larger than they are in terms of corruption and all of these other painful issues that every country has, but that for different reasons have become especially painful topics in Ukraine, both because of the war, because of Russian propaganda efforts, because of sensitivities towards how the information environment in the West might affect support to Ukraine, and therefore Ukraine's, literal ability to survive. So for all good reasons, but we're going to see a focus on that. And of course, I think as well, to not forget about the occupied territories and what's happening there, because the propaganda there is becoming increasingly, I think terrifying would be the word I would use, in that sense of they're not really trying to convince, they're trying to terrify people. Those people who are going to be convinced to join the Russian world, as it were, they've already got them. And for the rest of the people, there's just a constant relay of information about how, anybody who works for the resistance is basically a drug addict. They are, creating samagon or moonshine somewhere in their basement. They're, dealing drugs. These are terrifying people. That anybody who has any sympathy towards Ukraine will be found, will be caught. That, terrible things will happen to them. Even we've seen children paraded on some of the on the Ruski Mir satellite channels that are only available in the occupied areas. We've seen children paraded on these channels, and so I think there's going to be this focus on, of course, demoralizing. This war will never end. It's just going to be awful. And on so demoralizing, but then also, of course, sort of dividing people, creating divisions in the free part of Ukraine, and in that part that's occupied. I think it's just going to be an increased terror. And it's funny, I've been reading recently about the Soviet campaign in Western Ukraine after 1945, and there's so many similarities in terms of with the occupied territories now, in terms of just how the nature of the huge number of ideological workers who were sent sort of from Moscow or from more pro-Soviet parts of Ukraine, to inculcate Western Ukrainians into this thinking. And I really want to revisit it in more detail, because you just think it's just history repeating itself, just this wiping out of people who resisted dictatorship, and then also just this incredible ideological flattening almost of people's own opinions. And in the face of when you have to pretty much accept that anyway because of brute force, it just makes me turn to think about what more can be done. I think, first of all, in the West, so that people know about the incredible, courageous resistance that's going on in these territories. It's almost every day you read that there's been an attack on an FSB or, you know, a Rosgvardia person. And also, perhaps different ways that can help, different ways of helping people who are still in the occupied territories to both get information out and so that information can be got in to them so that they don't feel forgotten, because it must be a very lonely and terrifying time for Ukrainians living under Russian occupation.
And what would be your overall general advice to our Stratcom experts, specialists, maybe those in government who work on communications, in terms of countering this malign propaganda and delivering their message to the world this year precisely?
Mm-hmm. Well, it would be bold of me to have, I mean, they did a very, very good job in 2022. I mean, an incredible job in terms of adapting it to each different audience. But I think the situation now is different, and what worked in 2022 won't work now, bluntly. So I would say two things: definitely continue to contextualize. But secondly, it feels really horrible to say this about sort of, I suppose, my own part of the world, but that a lot of this rhetoric, it doesn't about values that we use. It's not really worth appealing to that. Appeal to people's sense of money and appeal to people's strategic interest and security interest. And you already see Ukraine is doing that, in particular with its actions in Africa. I think they're very clever. But more needs to be done, almost not to be, rude, but almost to be tough and say, okay, guys, what do you think is going to happen if we fall? This is what's going to happen. We'll tell you. And what are you going to do? Because pretty much the only army capable of defending itself in Europe is your army, is the Ukrainian army. So I think it's maybe time for a bit of, speaking bluntly and also being honest about things, because I don't think it helps if Ukraine has so much trust. There's so much really, especially in the British context, there's really so much love for Ukraine. And I think that just being honest about the fact, this is really hard. You're fighting the Russian army. Of course it's hard. And I think it's okay to say, well, sometimes maybe like mistakes will be made, or sometimes, we're just human. Sometimes we're going to find it really hard. Sometimes we're going to perhaps say the odd comment that we shouldn't, and perhaps you will too, because this is a really difficult period. I think it's okay to be human. It's okay to not always control the narrative. I think people in general are a little bit tired of controlled narratives. So I think just speaking honestly and openly as human beings going through something really terrible and appealing to other human beings who can maybe do something to help that in general, I think that's probably the best approach for any communications.
Well, I hope Ukraine will succeed in that. Well, thank you very much for this insightful conversation. It was Dr. Jade McGlynn here at Ukrinform. See you next time.
Thank you.